Eventful year, to say the least, and the world of politics has been no exception. Huge aid packages, horrific revelations about long-term care, a looming fiscal snapshot instead of an actual update, and the Conservative leadership race. To break it all down from a partisan perspective, let's bring in the strategists. Finally, they're back. In the blue corner, we've got Adrienne Batra, the editor-in-chief of the Toronto Sun. In Liberal red, Proof Strategies' Greg MacEachern. He joins us from Ottawa, and also in Ottawa, flying the NDP flag, and McGrath, the NDP National Director. Hello to the three of you. Our strategists are back. I'm very happy about that. We haven't seen you guys in such a long time. But I want to start with a difficult topic. That not only, the commissioner of the RCMP has had a hard time with, but now it seems like even Canada's premiers are having a hard time with the definition of systemic racism. So let me start with you, Adrienne. Why did Justin Trudeau was not able to issue a statement from all premiers about this?
Well, because I think that most people actually have a disagreement on what systemic racism means. I mean, systemic racism can be defined as something that is maybe tacitly codified in whatever organization or entity that you're in. And I don't think that a lot of political leaders are prepared to either address that or acknowledge that for the risk of then having to deal with another whole host of challenges on if they even say those words. So I just don't think that you're going to find consistency in it. And frankly, but that's reflective, I think, of Canadians. I don't think that you're going to find a consistent answer amongst the population when it comes to things like that. And I think, when we talk about asking a politician to be very plain spoken about it, very few are. And it's, we probably got the most honest answers out of some of the Conservative leadership candidates last week at their debate, because at this point they're still in a race mode. But once you're elected and you start talking about those things, there's a different level of accountability for it. Though I think there should be a very straightforward answer when it comes to that very question.
Greg MacEachern, why is it so difficult for a lot of politicians to say yes or no?
That's a good question. Adrienne just referenced the Conservative leadership, and Aaron O'Toole had a lot of trouble with this question. He struggled with this question, which led to a lot of questions about why, and was it a play for a certain part of the base of the Conservative Party? And if that's true, that's not a good look for someone who wants to lead. I disagree with Adrienne. I think that we can start with knowing what systemic racism is not. We know that the commissioner of the RCMP struggled with this and struggled very publicly, and that should have been a lesson to all of our leaders. Whether Canadians are falling into a certain place about the definition, be damned. Our leaders need to lead here. The premiers should not be surprised that they have to address this. I can tell you, as someone who works in corporate Canada, our companies, our organizations in Canada are working very hard and very quickly to address this. I sit here very much as a white man who's experienced no racism in my life, and just by talking to colleagues, friends, it's very evident it's there. So I don't think this is a good look for the premiers. I think we saw some indications that these weekly calls over the last couple of weeks have been tougher and tougher to get agreement on. The problem for certain premiers is there'll be questions asked of each of them about whether or not they're able to land on a definition. And they really, really shouldn't be surprised if they get into trouble if they get into trouble by not providing one.
Well, Anne McGrath, I want to ask you, because a Bloc Québécois MP did get into trouble when he refused to vote in the House on a motion about systemic racism, and your leader actually called him a racist in the House. It is a very emotional debate, very, very important and fundamental debate here in Canada. Do you think that by calling him a racist in the House, we brought the conversation forward?
Well, I think the conversation is very dominant right now period. I mean, with the increasing numbers of cases of police brutality, the way that those cases are dealt with, the whole controversy about whether or not the RCMP commissioner was even willing to acknowledge the existence of systemic racism. But I think that the actual unanimous consent motion that Jagmeet Singh had presented in the House, where he was looking for unanimous consent, had some very clear steps in it to deal with systemic racism in the RCMP, which is the remit of the federal government, right? And so I think that my own preference would be that if the Prime Minister and the Liberal Party and the government were more focused on actually doing some of the things that can be done, some of the actionable things, rather than the kind of, a little bit more theatric trying to get the premiers on board. Clearly, the premiers have a responsibility to act, but the federal government has responsibility for the RCMP. There is systemic racism, and there are things that can be done. And I think that it's action that is the most important thing here.
Interesting. When I was a junior reporter in Montreal, this was, a few decades ago, I'm not going to say how many, we had this conversation about the Montreal police. It was an interesting conversation, and it seems that, some 30-some years later, we're still having the conversation. However, it seems that, people are engaged in this conversation, which is huge progress from the time in Montreal when we talked about it. But we have to go to the fiscal snapshot. We're going to talk money now. So we're going to get a fiscal snapshot finally. So we don't have a budget. We didn't have an update, but now we're calling it a snapshot. I thought it was an interesting word. I'm going to go to you, Greg MacEachern. What are you hoping? What are you expecting in this fiscal snapshot? It's important, but they're telling us it won't be much because we can't look very much ahead of a few weeks, a few months.
Yeah, I understand the challenge for the government. Things are still moving fairly quickly. They're still getting policies out the door that they're adjusting, listening to stakeholders. And I think we saw a little bit of this evidence when the information about mapping and predicting where COVID-19 was going to go, some people took that and projected it. There was a lot of challenges for the government in terms of after providing that information. And I say this governments because it was both federal and provincial, trying to explain to people in the media who are then going to explain it to Canadians, there was some challenges there. So I think the government is being a little bit slow on this because they want to make sure that it comes out right. But I think what they need to do is basically send a message that they're aware of the amount and the size of the deficit and what's going to end up on the debt and what the plans are. The challenge is we don't know what the fall is going to look like. We don't know what a second wave is going to look like. And I think the biggest challenge for the government is that we live next door to the United States, where we see record numbers of COVID-19 occurring again. We saw, I think Premier Ford said today that he does not want to see the U.S. border open in July. I think a lot of Canadians would agree with Premier Ford on that. So I think, but that also has a big impact on our economy. So it's a tough road for the government. They've got to send a message that they're on top of this, but it's hard to predict what's going to happen in light of just watching the United States.
So, Adrienne, there's been a lot of spending in the last 3 months. What are you going to be looking at? Too much spending? How are they going to pay it back? What are you hoping to find out on July 8th?
Well, this is one of the few times I'd probably agree with Greg. I think it's really just unpredictable right now. I mean, we had a report from the Parliamentary Budget Officer just last month saying that his projection of a $252 billion budget deficit was probably optimistic, because the challenge is the goal is moving constantly. And, we've seen Justin Trudeau's Liberals expand and extend a number of these relief programs. Whether or not they should have done that is certainly questionable, but the spending is continuing. So it's really hard to really nail things down. But as far as what we should be looking for is, eventually Canadians are going to have to pay these bills that have been racked up. Yes, they had to get money out the door quickly when COVID-19 hit very, very fast. Canadians, pocketbooks were hit very, very fast. Again, exposing just how, we really are 2, 3, 4 paychecks away from real financial ruin as individual Canadians, as we're so stretched already. So things are positive when you're spending, but eventually that money has to get paid back. Today's debts are tomorrow's taxes. We likely will see potentially increased taxes, regardless of what Bill Morneau has said that he won't do that. So I think even with our credit downgrade that we saw this week as well, borrowing is going to be even more difficult, and big spending stimulus packages to have an economic recovery is hard. And the country's largest economy is opening, last, meaning Ontario. So too many unpredictables. And if we have a second wave, as we've already talked about, that exasperates and puts more pressure, and we have future generations that are going to have to pay for these massive deficits.
Anne McGrath, I have no time left. But I want to give you the last word. Will the spending have to continue? Yes or no?
This pandemic has exposed very glaring inequalities in our society, and we need to actually deal with them. And there are social and economic costs to austerity that I don't think that we can manage. So I think that there does need to be. I think the spending has been necessary, and I think that there does need to be a stimulus plan to get the economy to a place where those inequalities don't exist anymore. Whether it's in long-term care, other parts of healthcare, or just our basic social safety nets.
Well, that's all the time we have. Anne McGrath, Adrienne Batra, Greg MacEachern, thanks so much for being there. Have a great weekend. Have a great summer. And I hope eventually we'll be able to have you back in studio.
That would be nice.
Have a great summer. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.